subscribing to different publishers. We're talking well into the kind of tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. Okay. Thank you for reminding me to give a little bit of context on open access. But of course, open access publishing kind of has its own unique challenges. It kind of shifts the cost of publishing from the reader to the author who's kind of publishing that work. So there are some challenges there, which I'm happy to talk about, but I'm not going to focus on that for the purposes of this talk. I just want to talk about kind of these other challenges to access beyond making the paper itself available to other researchers. But as I mentioned here, there's multitudes of benefits that one can derive. So having an open access publication means that more people can read it, so more people can benefit. The author can benefit directly by, for example, getting more exposure to their work or having higher citation rates, whereas members of the public or practitioners who are building on top of that work might also be able to apply the findings more easily. So just as the benefits of open access publishing are multifaceted, I think so too are the challenges. So as I alluded to, making scholarly communication truly accessible, I think, takes more than just uploading a paper to the internet. So there's certain technical barriers. For example, a paper might not be accessible to people who are less fluent in English, which is the primary language for a lot of scientific communication. It might not be accessible to people with poor internet connection or who use assistive reading technologies to read papers. Papers might also not be adequately machine readable, which makes it hard to search and discover their contents. There are also disciplinary barriers. So a researcher from a different discipline might have difficulty coming in and understanding the content of a paper because there are different communication norms and relations to prior work, which they're maybe not familiar with. So there's many computer scientists in the room. I think if you've ever tried to read a paper, for example, from biology or physics, you probably know what I mean. And related to this, there's also knowledge barriers, right? Perhaps a out-of-domain researcher or member of the public is coming in and reading these papers, and there's lots of technical language and jargon to make sense of, as well as this need for a lot of background knowledge to even know what a paper is talking about. And then there's practical barriers. So for someone who's a practitioner or maybe a policymaker who's looking to act based on the findings of the paper, they might wonder about why the paper or the results are relevant or actionable in their setting. So that's just kind of a taste of some of the barriers that I think are potentially exist towards the accessibility of documents beyond even just making it accessible to the public. So the main premise of today's talk is essentially that generative AI, or especially these large language models, have the potential to help us reduce some of the barriers to scholarly information.
Just one more, because I sometimes teach scientific writing. Okay, and it's embedded in one of your barriers, but is erroneous expectations of who the readers will be.
Yes.
So you don't know what I call the public, right?
Well, so I think as a writer of scholarly works, we're not really writing to the public. We're writing to other people.
I mean, the public is, I'm always thinking about who's going to read it. And I consider it the people who are going to read what I wrote. Okay. And sometimes it may be beginners. So there's technical barriers, that's but you mentioned technical barriers, but it's something that I call them the public. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right.
I think there's really just like a diverse pool of people out there who might be able to benefit from what we're writing. And typically we're only able to write to some subset of them. And even then, kind of not necessarily always very well, right? Because I think there's communication challenges.
But I like the barrier, the way you show them. Anyways.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just an abstract way of, I think, illustrating some of the barriers, but I think there's many more challenges beyond what I showed. Um, but uh, but kind of back to this narrative, which is, I think that these new generations of large language models can help us reduce some of these barriers to information access. And I think there's two features of large language models that are going to be particularly helpful. And the first is that these models can help us quickly transform the language, the format, the tone, the content, as well as some of the examples in these scholarly works to try to make them more accessible for different audiences. So as Claudia just said, we typically write to one audience, but that doesn't mean that our work shouldn't be able to benefit other audiences. We just currently don't have a way of quickly transforming that work into a format that's going to benefit the other audience. And then the other feature of these models is that now we can apply them in certain settings to synthesize information across many documents. So tens, hundreds, thousands of documents in a really kind of useful way. So I'm going to try to highlight some of these features and the kind of capability of these models to reduce barriers in scholarly information access through three projects that I'm involved in that leverage large language models to help transform papers for different audiences and purposes. So the first of these, we build a system to transform HCI findings or human computer interaction findings for UI UX designers. So this is user interaction and user interface designers. And then in the second work, we augment medical papers with accessibility features to help improve their understandability for healthcare consumers. These are non-expert healthcare consumers. And then in the last, we investigate how to synthesize threads of research together into a useful overview. And through these examples, I think I'm kind of hoping to highlight both the kind of potential benefit as well as the limitations of these models. So to start, I'll describe the first system, which tries to improve access to design findings for these design practitioners, UI UX designers. So I'll start by saying that a picture is worth 1,000 abstracts. So this is a paper I found in PubMed on plant sciences. That's a biomedical paper repository hosted by the U.S. National Institutes of Health. Now, I don't really know anything about the topic of this paper since I don't work in plant biology, but it seems to be something about stress in crop plants. Okay, I could read the abstract to get a sense of the paper's goals and results, but alongside this textual abstract, the authors actually also provided this nice visual abstract. So visual abstracts have gained quite a lot of attention in scholarly publishing. So this is, what is it? It's usually a diagram that conveys a high-level overview of the main content and findings within a paper. So many publishers now encourage these as a kind of companion to your classic textual abstract. So I hope I don't have to make a very difficult argument that this visual abstract is a little bit easier to engage with and provides a very nice high-level overview of what this work is about and what it's trying to study. So essentially, I think these multimodal representations, so textual, image, kind of other media, these multimodal representations are really effective tools for scholarly communication. And we wanted to test how well this might work on a subset of human-computer interaction papers that communicate design findings for design practitioners. So this is just a screenshot of an example paper from the ACM Digital Library, and it's a paper published in Kai about how older adults use online videos for learning. So this kind of paper, this flavor of paper, and many others like it, they communicate their main findings in something called a design guideline or design implication section. So these have the primary actionable recommendations that the authors think can be used by designers when designing real-world systems. So these guidelines are typically, as you can see, textual descriptions, which can be really challenging for designers to engage with. And in fact, when we ask designers whether they read these design guidelines that are sort of written for them, the design practitioners report that they don't. They rarely engage with these papers. They rarely read these findings, in which case they're not actually kind of building necessarily on top of these kind of empirical findings. So we investigate whether we can improve the communication of these design findings by kind of transforming the findings into a multimodal artifact called a design card. So this work was led by my student at UW, Donghoon Shin. And these design cards are pretty nice because they're already established as a tool that designers use to communicate design implications. So they're textual and image-based, they're multimodal. And then we investigated in a formative study with designers what the various components of this design card should be, as well as the level of detail that's provided by designers in, for example, the textual generation as well as the image generation. And then based on the results of that study, we decided on this design. So the card has two faces. It starts with a title and a short description of the design implication, and then has a generated image to illustrate the target population or the kind of use case setting. And then on the second face, we include a short summary of the paper itself, as well as an evidence quote that we extract directly from the paper to help support this design finding. We automatically create the design card from a paper by chaining various extraction and text classification models with prompts to large language models to shorten and summarize text and produce a prompt for the text to image model. So we actualized this pipeline at the time using GPT-3 and DALL-E 2, although any large language model or text-to-image model can be easily substituted in as the technology improves. So I'm not sure how much experience people in the room have had with these large language model technologies, but they can quickly generate reasonable quality text in a variety of domains, including in kind of scholarly communication. So we then conducted a user study where we evaluated the quality of the design card outputs by asking designers as well as the authors of the original HCI papers to evaluate the quality of these generated design cards on various facets. And some of these facets, two of them related to creativity, are inspirability and generativity. So how able is the design card to inspire new ideas, and how is it able to generate new kind of design prototypes. Okay. So, and then some of the kind of results from the qualitative study, the designers generally enjoyed having a visual graphic to kind of inspire their creativity, and they found the raw text format from the original papers very boring to read, unsurprisingly. And then, of course, they also found that design cards could enhance the delivery of the original author's contribution in a meaningful way. Of course, here we demonstrate that the generative AI models can be used to kind of quickly transform the format of scholarly communication from something that's just text-based to something that's multimodal to encourage more engagement in creative tasks, creative downstream use cases. But of course, there are kind of challenges to this type of approach, right? Because we're using generative AI to produce some of the elements of the design card, we're sometimes injecting the biases of those models into those processes. And that's a limitation and a challenge that we're dealing with as we move forward on this project. So that's the first system. In the second system, I'll talk about how we investigate ways to improve access to medical papers for healthcare consumers. So this is a very different domain. This work was led by an AI2 intern, Tal August, and we were motivated by this challenge that non-expert readers, sometimes they try to read medical papers to glean information. For example, maybe they're a patient or caretaker of someone suffering from a rare disease for which only experimental treatments are available. So there's no kind of general purpose, general audience targeted content for them to read. So then we applied a bunch of NLP techniques to help simplify the content and language of medical research as presented in these papers to make them more accessible to non-expert readers. So we first conducted a formative study where we interviewed non-expert readers who have experienced this process, like reading healthcare papers to look for information. And I think this quote kind of sums up the problem quite well. So participant 8 says, honestly, reading that stuff, it was just overwhelming how much terminology I didn't know to start off with. So in response to a number of barriers that were identified by participants in our formative interviews, we designed 3 types of interactions to facilitate consumer access to these papers. So the first interaction is a tooltip with term definitions. So we identified jargon and named entities in the paper and then linked them to definitions from trusted sources such as Wiktionary, Wikipedia, and the Unified Medical Language System. So we then surface these definitions in tooltips where a user can click the term while reading the paper to gain access to the definition. The second interaction is section summaries. So scientific papers are organized in sections, and it can be unclear to a non-expert which sections are maybe more or less important to read. So instead of reading a whole section, so for example, what's highlighted in blue on the right side, that's a whole section in a paper, we provide or we generate these more simplified summaries of the sections to allow quick, kind of a quick overview of the main concepts described in that section. And then a reader can read the simplified summary to determine whether they want to read more in detail. So these are generated by prompting GPT-3 and then shown in a tooltip by the header for each section. And then the last interaction that we introduced was more prescriptive. We identified a number of key questions that people are likely to ask about medical papers. So these questions are derived from frameworks such as PICO. So PICO stands for Population Intervention, Comparator, and Outcome. So some of the questions that are associated with that framework would be who is being studied in this paper? What are the interventions that are being studied? How are outcomes assessed? Like what metric is being used? And what were the primary results? So we then provide these questions in a sidebar along with the original paper, and users can click on them to then be taken to the section of text in the paper that then answers that question. And then we also provide a simplified summary version of the answer in order to encourage ease of understanding. So this system that we built is called Paper Plane. And we applied the 3 interface features I just described and used them to augment the original PDF of the medical paper. And each of these features combines various information extraction models that we trained in-house with prompting large language models or linking to external knowledge bases to derive more information or simplified summaries. And when we evaluated this system, we found that we had dozens of users kind of interact with our system in various with kind of various mixtures of features. And the users reported that the interactions we introduced were likely were perceived to decrease the difficulty of reading these papers while increasing the perceived understanding and confidence that they had. So the top row here shows the self-reported difficulty, understanding, and confidence for the paper plane system, which has all 3 of those interface features I just described. And then the bottom row for the PDF baseline with no augmentation whatsoever. And then the middle 2 rows are where we ablated some of those interface features. So you can see that the self-reported difficulty was lower for paper plane, and for understanding and confidence was much higher than the PDF baseline. So in this work, our focus was on kind of improving things for healthcare consumers. But I actually believe that these types of AI-powered paper augmentations and transformations really have the potential to benefit other user groups as well. Like I would not mind having these types of augmentations if I were reading a paper outside of my primary domain. Just want to break if there's any.
I have a question about these augmentations, which I find very interesting. Mm-hmm. Would I, as an author, be able to add comments such as I can ask readers to think about a given issue concerning that topic, to make people think outside of what's actually written.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Claudia. I mean, I think, to be honest, I don't think these types of augmentations necessarily go far enough, right? In the kind of medium long term, I just think that the way that we communicate science is so informed by the way that we've communicated science for the past decades and centuries. And there's no reason why these papers can't be more interactive or collaborative, right? So if someone wants to comment on a reader wants to comment on the paper, why can't those conversations also be sort of associated with the paper? Why can't the paper be kind of a living document? Or why does it even have to be a paper? So I think there's lots of kind of other ways to go beyond augmentation that I'd be really curious to explore. Yeah. So thanks for that comment. And then the third study I'd like to discuss is shows how kind of AI-powered systems can help us improve access to multiple papers through synthesis and summarization. And actually, well, we'll see how far we get. Okay, so as some background, there are these types of papers called systematic literature reviews, and that aim to synthesize all available evidence on a subject. So they're typically seen as providing the highest quality of evidence for clinical care. However, they're super expensive to create. It can take a team of researchers somewhere between months or years to complete one of these very thoroughly. And they tend to also go out of date very quickly because there are typically delays in the publication process. And then so because reviews are sort of synthesizing existing information rather than producing new knowledge, a question that I've been interested in for some time is whether models can help us perform some of this summarization and evidence synthesis. So in work that was led by my intern, Jada Young, we created a data set of studies and summaries based on existing literature reviews published and indexed on PubMed. And this data set is called MS squared and is described in this EMNLP 2021 paper. And in this work, we wanted to create a data set to kind of study this problem of evidence synthesis. And we noted that the output summaries generated by our baseline models, it was very difficult to guarantee systematicity and factuality, right? So a lot of the model generations often diverged from human written literature review summaries on very essential points. And another thing we noted is that there were no good automated metrics for evaluating this type of tasks of multi-document summarization for medical literature reviews. So in some follow-up work that was published earlier this year at ACL, I led a team evaluating 7 of the automated metrics that existed or we introduced for this task of MSLR, which is multi-document summarization for literature reviews. So we evaluated metrics like Rouge and BERT score, which for those who work on text generation and summarization, these are very commonly reported metrics for summarization. We also evaluated delta evidence inference, or delta EI, and this is a divergence metric that we introduced in the original MS squared paper, which looks at the distributional differences between kind of model predictions of evidence direction between a generated and a target summary. Okay. And then we also examined several new metrics, including kind of sentence BERT model embeddings, fine-tuned for natural language inference, semantic textual similarity, as well as scientific claim verification through training on the SciFact dataset. We also introduced a metric called PIO overlap, which is an entity-centric extractive metric, where we looked at extracted population, intervention, and outcome spans. Those are the PIO spans, and how they differed between the generated and targeted summaries and target summaries, excuse me. And then we then annotated 6 different system outputs for summary quality. So we ran 6 different multi-document summarization systems on this task and evaluated their outputs. And we manually assess the 4 summary quality facets listed here: fluency, whether the text is fluent; PIO agreement, which is whether the population, intervention, and outcomes agree between the reference and the generated summary; whether the effect direction agrees; and whether the strength of the claim made in the text agrees. So 2 professional annotators with graduate biomedical backgrounds annotated 600 summaries from these 6 models. And then we also provided pairwise comparisons between some of the model generations. And based on our annotations, we found that the model rankings that were produced by these different metrics, the automated metrics and the human, were quite different from the human evaluation. So they're quite divergent. These are what I'm showing in this table are these system rankings that are produced by each metric or evaluation, human evaluation facet. So 1 would make the system the best and 6 the worst. So because this analysis is conducted just on a sample of data, we're not making any statements about true system rankings. We're just saying that between the metrics and human assessments, we're getting very inconsistent system rankings.
I'm sorry, because the machine metrics are numbers that appear, they are not magic, of course, but whereas humans, they are more subjective in their assessment, right? So how would you be able to compare subjective versus objective metrics in this very specific, very difficult case?
Yeah, so that's also kind of why we're not looking at something like correlation between automated metrics and human evaluation, although we do examine that. What I'm showing here are just the system rankings produced by evaluation. So according to Rouge, ITTC2 had the highest Rouge score, and BART, the baseline model, had the lowest Rouge score. Whereas for the human evaluation facet, through kind of hundreds of evaluations per system, the human evaluation facet found that ITTC2 produced the most fluent generations, whereas SciSpace produced the least fluent. So that's what I'm showing here.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. You are not. I thought you'd say, "Oh, that shows us." I'm sorry. Okay. I'm misunderstood.
It's a great question, because I think we still look at something like correlation between machine metrics and human evaluation, but it's true that we kind of have to correct for the subjectivity of humans. So like if you have multiple annotators, sometimes the distribution of annotations between those annotators can be hugely different, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And even as they say, when you start marking exams and you have had a good lunch, you're more generous than if you're hungry or whatever. Anyways, okay.
Yeah, that's a great point. But kind of looking at this ranking level, we still see huge differences. So a system like the first row, ITTC1, that's ranked relatively highly by all human evaluations. So in the top half of rankings, but it's rated quite poorly by most automated metrics.
Yeah,
so
that's very interesting.
Yeah. And then you have systems like SciSpace, where the automated metrics rank it really highly, but the human evaluation facets, human evaluation essentially says that the system outputs are quite poor. Right?
That's actually, these are very interesting findings. I mean, as you said, you were not going to correlate one with the other, but something is wrong somewhere. whatever.
something's wrong somewhere, and we are using these types of kind of both the automated metrics and the human eval to sort of make judgments about which system is better than another. And for example, if in a kind of more practical sense, like if you're choosing a system to deploy, how much can we kind of trust the comparisons that we're doing? Yeah. So some metrics, we found showed some promise. So like something like PIO overlap, which is a entity-centric automated metric, actually aligns quite well with the human evaluation facet of PIO agreement. And that's exactly what we want. So we want an automated metric to maybe track really closely to a very related human evaluation facet. But nonetheless, I think the point of my showing this is that our results uh, suggest that this kind of automated evaluation is still really difficult for tasks like this, where we care about different facets of the output summary. Um, and in this case, we actually have a reference summary. I think in the slides I'm about to show, there are a lot of multi-summarization tasks, multi-document summarization tasks for which we don't really have good reference summaries. They're even harder tasks. So here's an example. Is more recently, I've been kind of, instead of synthesizing results, I've been investigating whether we can synthesize threads of research into kind of an useful overview document. So these overviews, the goal of these would be to serve as some kind of introduction into a new or emerging scientific topic, as well as highlighting kind of major themes of ongoing research for a known topic. So this work was led by my intern, John Georgi at AI2. And the way we implemented this is we begin by searching a database, in this case PubMed, for relevant literature on a biomedical entity or concept, for example, microplastics. And then we take the top K titles and abstracts coming out of the database. And in this case, K can be very large, thousands of documents or more, maybe tens of thousands. And then we cluster these together using document embeddings. We then sample from these clusters and prompt a model like GPT-4 to synthesize an overview from the sampled documents. Okay. And we call this a topical page, but it's really just a topical overview. And clustering really plays a pretty major role in this task. So here are some example clusters on just 3 topics that we produced overviews for. So for something like microplastics, you can see that the first cluster contains papers that describe some relationship between microplastics and wastewater treatment. And then the second cluster contains papers on microplastics and aquatic environments. And the sizes of the clusters provide some sense of the distribution of work among these different topics. So then we combine essentially the retrieval, clustering, and sampling approach with controlled generation through prompting to produce a topical overview as on the right. So let's look at this overview a little bit more closely. This is an entity-centric research summary. So in this case, on the entity known as long COVID. We generate an overview statement that defines the entity and its importance to the scientific literature. The main body of this summary then consists of the major research themes that we identified from the retrieval and clustering results. And then all of the claims are supported by citations to the sampled input articles. And then we finish with an overview of major directions for future work. So for a task like this one, I think we can make the argument that generating these types of overview pages could be helpful for someone who's trying to gain kind of a high-level overview of this topic. But we really don't have any kind of ground truth for these types of overviews, right? They're often on topics that are a little bit more emergent than something that you would typically see in a Wikipedia page. So we don't have ground truth kind of Wikipedia style descriptions of these topics. And it's a complex task, right? We need to evaluate both the quality of the overview page itself, as well as, for example, whether all the claims are properly supported by citations to input documents, whether there's any redundancy in the claims that are made, and so on, and whether any information is missed. These are really challenging things to evaluate. So maybe a question that I'm more interested in kind of finding the answer to than having an answer to is, how do we evaluate complex tasks such as this one? And I don't think that a lack of good evaluation means that we shouldn't study tasks like this. I think it's just it's kind of a barrier to figuring out how to move forward on a task like this. And that kind of brings me to the kind of last point I sort of want to make in this talk, which is, how do we understand how to use these generative models safely and effectively, right? I'd say towards this, I've been exploring two directions. One is human AI collaborative systems, and the other is methods for trying to improve factuality in generation, as well as better evaluation methods. So for the sake of time, I'm going to provide an example of just the former, just the first bullet point there, on human AI collaborative systems. So for some background, in 2021, I co-led a study with Isabel Cachola, who's now a PhD student at Johns Hopkins Computer Science, where we investigated the accessibility of scholarly documents. And in that work, we found that most scholarly PDFs are not accessible for blind and low vision readers or users who are reading these papers with screen readers or other assistive reading technologies. So essentially in an eyes-free setting. We reviewed over 10,000 scholarly PDFs from different fields, and we found that 75% of them, approximately, did not meet any of the 5 accessibility compliance criteria that we assessed. So quite poor situation. So in that analysis,
sorry. Oh, yeah, because I'd like to know about the accessibility criteria, and they came right afterwards. Sorry, forget
Yeah,
it.
no. So the criteria that
They
we
are over there. Yeah.
investigated
Okay.
were the presence of alternative texts, which are kind of textual descriptions of images in papers, the existence of tagged table headers, so whether table structure was noted, whether the PDF was tagged, so whether section headings and sections were tagged appropriately, whether a default language was specified, and whether a tab order or reading order is specified. So these are certainly not the only compliance criteria. There are dozens more, but these, I think, have been evaluated by others before and give a very good kind of high-level representation of how much, how accessible for assistive reading technology a PDF might be. Yeah. So in our analysis, we also looked at how accessibility compliance changed over time. And we found that there was some modest improvement over time for some of these criteria, but that the kind of overall average compliance rate was still quite low at around kind of 15% in 2020-ish. And then the rate of meeting all 5 criteria we assessed was pretty constant over the years. So somewhere around a baseline level, about 2.5%. So as part of the study, we also interviewed a number of blind and low vision scholars. So we found that among the scholars, this was a very well-known issue. So because of poor accessibility of scholarly documents, these BLV users, blind and low vision users, had to employ many coping mechanisms when they encounter an inaccessible paper. So for example, they might try other PDF readers in case they work better. They might message authors to try to gain access to a source document, for example, a LaTeX or Microsoft Word document that's more accessible than the PDF that's publicly available. They may, for people who have access to remediation resources, so some university libraries and accessibility offices will make a document accessible for people who need it. So if someone has access to these resources, they can request remediation. Although this can usually take days or weeks and is typically not fast enough for quickly skimming a paper as part of the research process, right? Because sometimes when we're doing research, we're reading or skimming dozens of papers a day. And then finally, many users reported just having to give up and abandon inaccessible papers, sometimes at a very high rate. So in response to these findings at the time, I led the development of a system called paper to HTML converter. So this prototype is still publicly available at paper2html.org. So you're welcome to try it. At this web app, a user can upload a scientific PDF into the application. We then run a series of models to extract content from the paper. So we extract and link the metadata to an entry in the Semantic Scholar database. We then extract the body text and references, as well as the figures and tables, and then reassemble all of these components into a tagged HTML document that has kind of an appropriate inferred reading order and all of the section headings and figures tagged as to what they actually are. We also implement a few useful features like a table of contents to allow for quick navigation through the document, as well as links between the text and the references to allow the user to quickly navigate between the two, even in an eyes-free setting. So paper to HTML offers this kind of quick, on-demand, but maybe lesser quality remediation service, right? But it resolves some of the issues that we found were commonly described by blind and low vision users as pain points, but it doesn't address all the issues. And most importantly, some of the elements of document accessibility, they really require author intervention. So specifically, I'll point to this, right? Alt text. Alternative text are these written descriptions of image content that make images comprehensible when someone can't view the image. So as you can see, based on at least the results of our study, which has also been corroborated by other studies, that the alt text rates have not increased over time. So I think my interpretation of this is that the accessibility improvements that we're seeing in these scientific papers, they're not necessarily due to author intervention. They could be due to other things like software just automatically tagging the PDF and in a better way. So a question here is, why aren't there more alt texts available for scholarly papers? So one reason is definitely that there's a lack of knowledge and awareness, as well as kind of mandates, community mandates for including alt text in scholarly publishing, right? It takes a lot of effort to do this kind of work. And if we're not kind of required to do it or have easy tools to help us do it, why would we, right? And then in some follow-up work, we also found that scientific alt text is just really difficult to write, especially compared to kind of alt text in other domains. So in a study we published in Assets 2022, which was led by my student Sanjana Chintalapati, we found that among a small proportion of scientific figures that do have alt text, so that kind of 2.5% sample or less, some 70% of the author-written alt texts about these figures actually didn't contain sufficient information to understand all key aspects of the image. So for example, some of the alt texts might have missed describing the primary trends or correlations that would have been clear to a sighted reader, but not to someone who can only read the figure description. And in other work by Williams et al., the authors interviewed in their study reported difficulties around not knowing what information to include, how much detail to provide, as well as these kind of conflicting and confusing guidelines. So in response to this, we addressed this issue of difficult alt text writing in recent work that's led by my AI2 intern, Nikhil Singh. Here we introduce a human AI collaborative alt text writer. So the writing assistant operates like this. A user first uploads a paper into our system that's more or less complete. We extract the figures, the figure captions, as well as the textual mentions and descriptions of each figure from the paper. We then run a series of image understanding models to classify the figure type, extract the data tables for the plots and charts, and use an OCR engine like Tesseract to extract textual components of the image. We then combine all of this data together and the metadata about the figure. With these guidelines we identified from other sources about how to write alt text, and then prompt a large language model to help generate alt text suggestions and completions. So a little bit about guidelines. I think we did quite a bit of work kind of assembling guidelines from different sources and kind of organizing them in a hierarchical way. So I just want to point to that. These guidelines, we have some general guidelines which we adapted from the Diagram Center, which are always included in the large language model prompt. If a figure is a plot, we include plot description guidelines from SIG Access, as well as the semantic level framework defined by Lundgaard and Satyarayanan. And finally, for each type of plot, for example, if it's a scatter plot or line plot or box plot, we append a corresponding scatter plot guideline from the Diagram Center. So all of these relevant guidelines for each figure are included in the prompt for that figure when generating alt text suggestions. And here's a screenshot of our interface in action. So a figure has been extracted from an uploaded paper along with its textual descriptions. We have an LLM, a large language model. In this case, we use GPT-4, which makes use of all of this data and metadata along with the custom alt text guidelines. And we provide a baseline generation of the alt text as a starting point for the user. We also incorporate potential user questions and answers as a way of reminding authors, hey, here's some missing information that you might want to add into your alt text. And then ultimately, the author finalizes the alt text by either copying from the generation, auto-completing with the generation model, or writing to fill in the blanks of the alt text. And the resulting alt text is something that the author kind of certifies and sees fit to represent their original figure. So we conducted an evaluation study with paper authors, and we found that, unsurprisingly, authors vastly preferred having alt text writing support to not having any support. So the participants noted some things like the suggestions were really helpful. They help point out certain points that they might have missed if writing the alt text from scratch. Some participants noted that the original generation was pretty good and didn't really need that much editing. And yet other participants made some interesting observations. So, for example, the generation feature we had encouraged them to use their own brain as they were writing rather than just defaulting to the model generation, which is always a good thing. And also another user commented that the writing support encouraged them to think about the paper and the text that they might want to include in their discussion section. So helping them to think beyond the alt text. So these are really positive observations for this kind of collaborative authoring interface, where we enhance the productivity of the author while maintaining their involvement in the process. And so this is where I'll leave you. I'll summarize the main points of this talk and provide a few promising directions that I see for AI-assisted scholarly communication. The first of these is broadening the reach of scholarly publishing, right? So because we can now quickly transform our scholarly outputs, can we better reach interdisciplinary researchers or practitioners like clinicians, designers, and policymakers, as well as members of the public? So how do we kind of improve the accessibility of scholarly communication for these different audiences? Can we use these models to synthesize knowledge from across different publications? So I kind of I showed kind of some work in progress where we're doing semi-automated generation of these topical summaries. So a question here is what's possible, right? Can we then use these models to help us generate scoping reviews or literature reviews or systematic reviews, right? These are, each of these is, has kind of like a higher rigor in terms of the amount of information that's included in them. So if this is possible, what are the new workflows going to be for integrating this type of generated content into the traditional scholarly communication process? And then finally, I think we can use AI assistants to help authors with content creation, especially of difficult content. having an expert in the loop, so that having the author in the loop can help ensure factuality while making the most use of generative AI. And in that last example I showed, I think we can be building tools that make us better researchers and communicators rather than replacing us, which is, I think, the typical kind of AI fear. So I'd like to acknowledge all my students, interns, and collaborators with whom I conducted the work that I presented here today. My contact information is on the left, and in the remaining minutes, I'd love to take some questions and discuss.
Thank you. If you can, yeah, I wanted you to go back to that slide.
Yeah, I was like, let me put it on this slide.
Pessoal, tem alguma pergunta? Pode fazer em português, eu traduzo, ou pode enviar pelo chat. Because there are 13 people live in the room. Alguém tem alguma pergunta? Because actually, because I teach scientific writing, and I'm teaching it again next semester in English.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was wondering whether the issue is how generic are these tools? Are they specific to, medical texts, or are they? I'm thinking more of the not the ones that do summarization, but the ones that would help you write. The ones that the comment was, they make my brain work.
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal, right?
I love that. Okay. So I wonder how and whether I could ask the students to use one such tool. If it was easy to use or whatever, it would require special training, because that would be an interesting exercise that I could even share with you the results, of writing an abstract or writing something with a figure and having the tool help you write about it. How generic would that be?
Yeah, so I mean, nothing I showed here is particularly generic, but actually all I think there's like plugins that exist already where, something like GPT-4 is being integrated into for example, a writing interface like Overleaf. So I'm wondering kind of
what I'm talking. I'm sorry, I didn't explain what I was saying about generic. If I tell students to write a one-page text on some computer science topic and add a figure, and then try to apply these your AI tools to this writing exercise, whether that would be easy to use or whether it requires training to use.
I don't really think it requires training because we made use of a lot of interface elements that are kind of used commonly in this sort of co-piloting approach. So I think now co-piloting seems to be extended to any kind of inline writing assistance beyond just kind of code completion. So I don't really think training is necessary, but I think people really need to understand the limitations of these models. So in our study, we tested with authors, right? So authors in computer science tend to have some understanding of how large language models work. They know that the large language model is not guaranteed to generate factual information. And in fact, we show that, right? Like in the interface, if a model generates partially complete information, an author will just delete the wrong information and replace it with the correct answer, right? So in this case, the writing assistance is really meant more to indicate, hey, here's missing information that you need to add. But if it's someone who doesn't know that and is just kind of taking the model's output for what it is, that can be risky. Yeah.
Oh, okay. There's a question from Danilo. How did your team handle generative AI hallucination problem?
Yeah, great question. So I'd say in the kind of first three systems we presented. One of them is more for inspiring creativity. So I think the hallucination problems first of all, we evaluated and did not seem like hallucinations were a major problem there because we were just asking for a model to summarize from source and extract directly from the source document. For something like the alt text writer, we actually saw lots of hallucinations. But the way that we handled that is by integrating the large language model into a system where the author or the expert has more control on exactly what output is saved and attached or associated with the paper. And I think, at least in the medium term, that's going to be I think that's going to be the like a correct approach to take, right? Because even if the models get better at not hallucinating information, they don't have quite the like they're not necessarily going to be guaranteed to communicate things in a way that that conveys the author's original intention. And so as long as we're using these tools to help us assist in the creation of scholarly output that's kind of associated with a particular author, then I think having the author in the loop to make sure it's faithfully communicating their intentions is going to be an important part of that.
Ok. Anybody else? Alguém mais tem alguma pergunta ou alguma curiosidade sobre o que foi apresentado? I think that one of the issues is that you presented lots of interesting things. So people have to think a lot about this brave new world or whatever, and
It really is, yeah. Yeah. I'm curious how things are going to change and how dramatically things are going to change.
Okay. Paulo is saying amazing projects and ideas. And thanks for the presentation, Lucy.
Thank you. Yeah. Certainly if any points of conversation come up in the following days or weeks, I'd be happy to follow up.
Yeah, well, I will have I'll have to think about it because it would be great to see some of these tools at work when I teach scientific writing.
Mm-hmm.
You see, what made me think was that remark about made my brain work. Okay, yeah. So how would I, for instance, be able to take advantage of these tools to improve scientific writing?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm curious, Claudia, like how many of your students use these generative AI tools for writing?
Unfortunately, yeah, I guess lots of them, only they don't confess.
I see. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think it's a problem to use them, but I think there is a lot that goes into using them responsibly.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. No, that's what I meant. Yeah. So
that's a big question for us, is trying to figure out what the correct policy is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And more like, leveraging writing rather than lazying it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions to study there too, which is what is the impact of using these generative AI tools or LLMs on humans, right? Like, how does it change the way we approach problems?
Because it's now thinking how we reason, because that the guy said, or whoever said it, makes our brain works. But anyway, so Lucy, thank you so very much. We are going to make Paulo has raised.
I was just going to comment about that, because that's something that I think about these generative models, how much we are going to become maybe more reviewers of the content and not the generators of the content, right? Yeah. Maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it's just we will get more efficient, but exactly which will be like the impact on us as humans or specialists. Because if it generates very well the text, should I need to write this and maybe just I will review this and say, okay, it's very fine, it passes the idea that I want, right? So it's an interesting I don't know, doubt.
Yeah. Yeah, really, really good point. I mean, Paolo, I think like also the thing that I think about is so if essentially text becomes so easy to generate, then it kind of devalues text,
Yes.
which also means that we probably wouldn't be spending as much time reading, like either reading or writing. So then what are we doing?
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm. Yeah.
Thank you, Paulo. Mais alguém?
Mhm. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I guess that's it. So Lucy, thank you so very, very much for coming all the way from Seattle to
Yes, to Brazil.
visit
To come down.
with us. And I will contact you afterwards to see how practical or easy it would be to at least adopt one of these tools just as an exercise. Depends on the size of the class I'll have next year as well. It will be it's only 7 weeks.
Mhm.
Okay. And
That's a short class. Yeah.
it's it's 4 hours per week.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's 7 weeks, 4 hours per week. So it's a short course. It's very concentrated, and I'd have to think about it, but that's something I'd be really interested to try if it's not too much work for me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, let's talk about it. I would love to, for example, get some more feedback on usage for some of
Yeah, and,
these.
and I'd
Yeah.
love to learn more about how to help people write
Mhm.
and express themselves
Yeah.
through AI, if feasible.
Sounds
Okay.
sounds
So,
great.
pode parar de gravar.